that, and now I'll hand it over to Mary, who will talk about more of the stakeholder perspective, I think.
I will, and actually, I'm going to start. I added a slide. This is from this slide, and I'll start talking about it. There's a lot to absorb. This is a very reductive view of the results of a survey we did with disaster and emergency management researchers for cyber GIS. So it brings up and touches on a lot of the points we've talked about today, and it's a similar to what Mike was providing us, a different perspective on geodesign, certainly a more science oriented perspective on the design problem. And I want to start in the middle. Ooh, Heather, don't undetect me. Oh, I see it. I should have done this first. Give it a second. I'm probably going to go back. Okay, we're back. Don't touch that. Okay, so I'm going to start in the middle with simulation, because people, want to see some issue, some problem, something that they know needs to be done, simulated, and that the intervention is also in here. So this kind of combines that process and impact model from geodesign. And those simulations are feeding decisions, and the decisions that need to be made are determining the simulations that need to be there. And these were points that these researchers brought up. They also want to be able to make a decision about computational methods, because they recognize that there are different approaches to understanding the problem. And then these were other issues that they thought were important within the decision-making process. Of course, simulation, and we've touched on this a little bit, it must be supported by data and information. There are concerns with these, as well as a shared ontology and a shared representation of concepts. And this is about our model building, essentially, and how do our models cooperate with each other? How do they make sense to each other? Of course, on the other side, those simulations need to run in a very computationally intense environment. And they wanted, this is on the technical side, not just the conceptual side of integration, but the technical side of integration, that those models, that we're able to select them, that we're able to, I don't know what they pointed about inclusive was, I'm sure that include multiple perspectives, but they were getting at a lot of these points that we've brought up today. And of course, in the decision-making process, being able to communicate with others, being able to translate those quickly into an operational environment, and having a loop between those. So I just, because we haven't talked much about the kind of the cyber GIS geodesign perspective, I think Mike went into it a bit. I wanted to bring up the survey results at our very beginning of starting our project from the disaster and emergency management perspective. And you see a lot of what we've talked about iterated. So it's not just a landscape architect that has the needs. So certainly an emergency manager does as well, and we can think about them within a geodesign context. So now I'll go to my real presentation, and that is we are really focused on the collaboration piece within and the collaborative decision-making piece, and that within an analytic environment. And I'll get more into that, but I usually start out talking about what our goals are, and this time I decided to start out with what we are not, because we are often, I think, structural participation is often understood as just this, and so I really wanted to emphasize this point. There are some wonderful products out there for brainstorming, group brainstorming. One of a professional one that's used by many major companies, but these in particular that we'll recognize, a structured approach to having a group of people generate ideas and make a choice among them. That is not just what we are trying to accomplish with the Structured Participation Toolkit. We're not just trying to enable online communication. We're not just trying to brainstorm and reach consensus. We're also, to use Mike Goodchild and David Sweet's kind of thinking in terms about GIS as social media, it's not just the ability to create a map and share it. We have all these sharing options, or create a map and vote on it. So those are also not what we're trying to do with structured participation. So I decided I was going to try a different tactic. And while all of these things are very important and certainly components of any system, and components of Cyber GIS, you can create a map and share your visualization in CyberGIS. Right now, you can brainstorm ideas and vote on them using the SPT. But the goal is to go further, and I want to talk more about that. We want to support large-scale asynchronous participation. And that, I think, is probably the biggest point. And that's not just a chat. It's not just a threaded stream of conversation. The structured analytic deliberation is about being able to integrate that participatory support within the analytic environment so that you don't have to switch into a different environment to do your, like email or wikis, like we often do, to do your discussions, or even maybe a chat window at the bottom of the screen. It's not quite enough, because we do want to have the consensus building, and we also want to be able to trace decision making and have that in this decision repository. So you can see how many people participated in the decision and discussion, how many people chose what, and that's where those metrics come in. All of this is based on Herbert Simon's intelligence, design, and choice, and then iterative reflection. That is part of the deliberative workflow that we support. So I think that Let's Improve Transportation is a good example. That's one of two applications that the Structured Participation Toolkit draws from. This is work that another group of Tim's folks did, and they were able to do a lot of things. At this point, they're looking at transportation improvements and where those are. And ultimately, I'm going to go to the next slide because this gives you a better idea. They're mapping their own travel. They're talking about their travel concerns. They're looking at summaries of other people's concerns. And then they're developing transportation improvement factors. How are we going to make decisions to choose among transportation packages? And then they're creating their own. And so this is definitely a geodesign-oriented approach. It is a geodesign approach. And then finally selecting that, and there's a couple more steps. So it's not, this is a process. It's a lengthy process in some perspectives because it's about making real-world decisions that are going to have impact. And this is just to show you an example of one of the screens where people are generating these, essentially discussing, and the software is able to generate keywords for it, and those keywords become a structuring mechanism in creating, in that case, the transportation factors, weighting factors. In another case, in voicing climate concerns, the discussion was then used to develop indicators. So you start out with the big ideas, and you reduce those and get to a point of being able to structure them into some sort of decision environment. So that can be indicators, it can be metrics, it can be factors. What is the basis for our decision making, and that in a group discussion dynamic. So we said, well, how can we integrate this into the CyberGIS gateway? Because we wanted to support the analytic deliberative process. There are several different applications right now in the gateway, and we wanted to say, we want to support scientists in making their decisions when they're doing their science and discussing the results of their analysis. And we started out with a very simple iframe linkage, and that wasn't working out. So we had these monolithic applications that were great, voicing climate concerns and Let's Improve Transportation. They run in a local client server architecture, and they're all implemented in Java and JavaScript and Java server pages. But what we needed was to be able to plug into the gateway, into a different interface, essentially. We wanted to be able to have the client remote from the server. We wanted to keep all of the back-end logic and data storage on our servers, and we needed to be more technology independent because the gateway was not implemented in Java. So web services alone isn't going to do it for us. Much of our functionality is in the GUI. So we needed that pluggable GUI framework that would allow us to do cross-domain and cross-platform communication. And again, the hosting of our layers similar to as you would in a service-oriented architecture. So I don't know why I separated those. Ultimately, what we ended up doing is using XJS, which allows us to create these widgets. This is in the CyberGIS gateway, and this is what you get when you click on right now what's called feedback. And you're able to then talk about that. In this case, we're looking at an analysis or user input on using the specific application rather than solving a problem with the application. But both are possible. And it just gives you a sense here of what are they talking about. and whether or not people agree or disagree. That information, though, would be taken into a synthesis step to then prioritize, in this case, improvements to that software. But in another case, if it was focusing on analysis, it would be, well, how are we going to change the analytic workflow that's been set up? So I just wanted to show you that example. And like Rishi, a bit for the technology, it's fairly simple. XJS allows us to use JSON-P, which lets us inject the server response back into the client side. And that allows us to get over the cross-domain issues. So again, to try to support through the Structured Participation Toolkit, multiple modes of communication. When people are collaborating with each other, they want this remote anytime interaction. Certainly people are also working face-to-face and in real time, but we need to be able, I think, to support both. Of course, someone sitting next to each other computer is not going to go back in and put their decision into the system. We understand that. But I do think that is a goal of the Structured Participation Toolkit, is to be able to capture all of those, as well as different modes of degrees of integration. So integrating at the glass, that it really isn't necessarily technically integrated, but the user feels like it's integrated, and that's the example that we have that I'll show with our first effort of integration with the CSF. CSF doesn't really know anything about the SPT, but it allows us to plug in and to be present for the user, so it seems like it's integrated. The opposite end, we have tight coupling through point-to-point programming, and that's certainly how our standalone applications work. And we're trying to have essentially this middle ground again of loose coupling through standardized interfaces. So this was our first effort with I showed you the gateway. This was our first effort with the SPT, and Rob mentioned this application, and where people can compare scenarios. And we said, well, okay, let's let them also have a discussion about those scenarios, and in the next step, be able to choose which scenarios they prefer. And it was a pretty simple integration because we have these JavaScript widgets that Rob can plug into the CSF dashboard. Now we don't want to stop with that. I guess I should back up. I wanted to compare our workflows. Tim focuses a good bit on these. So on one level, you have the analytic workflow that's developing essentially this environment where people can create their different scenarios. And then at the same time, as it evolves, you have these multiple levels of our deliberative workflow. So the brainstorming, the synthesis, the categorization, so basically a choice and structuring of the things that were synthesized out of the brainstorming, and a review and selection. So that you would imagine using the SPT to go through the entire scenario comparison and ultimately make a decision at the end about which one people want to use. But these are different workflows, and they can work parallel to each other without having to have a lot of knowledge of each other. It's about where the widget is integrated into the interface, where the analysis is being done. But the analysis has its own model, essentially, that is supported by a deliberative workflow. This is just a different view, or an abstracted view, where we really looked at SPT as an embedded system within the CSF dashboard for participatory decision making. And the CSF is, in the background, it has the dependency editor and the workflow manager that's handling the analytic models and model of coupling. Our hope is to move towards, and this is what we're working on now, also bringing in analytic services that are hosted in the CyberGIS Toolkit, or perhaps somewhere else, but discoverable through the service registry. And that gives you an idea of kind of the front to back. And then one more, I guess, plug for the workflows. This was our initial effort that we, very simply, that we inject in the scenario development in this specific application. Here, that we're in the scenario at the end user level, integrating there, and that there's back-end connection to the toolkit, so that we're using CyberGIS for analytic processing. But ultimately, this is where we'd like to go, and that's where the SPT is being used to help do that analytic model development. So that very complex model that we saw is not just one user creating a model, but it may be a couple of different users or analysts in different places, and they're able to use the SPT to say, well, what do you think the input should be, and how should I connect this, and well, what is that model that I came up with? I think that works, but you know, so really integrating the SPT, I would like to see it at the workbench or the not the dashboard level only, but at the workflow editor level, and then, of course, then going back to that dashboard or end user level, also supporting the stakeholders in their decision making. And that's how flexible I think the structured participation toolkit is. I think it's capable of being used in those different places. I think that the gateway integration is where we've really tried to look more at this approach, but the initial design for SPT really focused on the end stakeholder. There's Let's Improve Transportation and Voicing Climate Concerns applications. I plugged us into where I think we fit within the geodesign framework, and here we're saying we want not only high performance computing but high performance collaboration. So certainly with stakeholder input, as I said, but also in the problem definition. What models are we using? And CyberGIS and CSF in terms of, and certainly geodesignstudy.com as another synthesis environment, being able to host the models. So what else do we need? I think I've touched on this, but really having SPT earlier in the process. So not just in dashboards with stakeholders, but also in the problem definition. And on the other end of it, integration of public sentiment apps. That's the SPT side, that we're not just having people have to type in what they think, but that we're able to pick up Twitter feeds, or RSS, or something that's kind of streaming in real time where people are interacting in their world, and we're grabbing that information rather than requiring people to provide it to us. And of course, they can still edit that information if they choose, but I'd like to see public sentiment apps integrated. And on the integration or on the technical side, working towards, and Rob has made progress on this, a lot of progress, the ability to harvest services from the gateway, service registry, and then this idea of organizing the models according to, right now you have to know what you're looking for and you have to know the meaning. And if we can do that, I'd say, and we may not get away from the natural language. I mean, data.gov I think works pretty well because you also put in a keyword and you make it 200 things that match your ideas, and then you have to know what you want. But really looking towards an ontological organization of those models, and certainly getting to the point that we're using CyberGIS with high performance computing services. So Dan Atkins, Mike invoked, and he also has written about high performance collaboration, and I'll let those others stand. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.